All right, this is our last short video about ecosystems. We're going to talk quickly about the 5 different roles that species can really play within their ecosystem when they are playing sort of a vital and important role. So we have these 5 roles: native species, non-native species, indicator species, keystone species, and foundational species. So we'll talk about those. Mostly native and non-native species. It's an either or. All species are either going to be native or non-native. Native species evolved in that ecosystem. So they've been there through sort of evolutionary history. They're well adapted to that ecosystem. They're sort of meant to live there. Non-native species have been introduced, and they can be invasive, although they're not always invasive. Just because they're not native doesn't mean they're invasive. Invasive implies a level of harm that is being created because of those introduced species. And many introduced species do become invasive, but some introduced species are just non-native. They just live in that environment. They don't cause any harm, but they didn't evolve there. That's not where they were from. Then we get into sort of the three important roles that species can play within an ecosystem, and not all species will fall into one of these categories, but some species are what we call indicator species. An indicator species is a species that is particularly sensitive to environmental quality, meaning if the environmental quality is harmed in some way by pollution or by human development, then they're sort of the first species to suffer. So they provide us early warning of a community that's being damaged. So they can be used by environmental scientists to monitor environmental quality. If you find these indicator species in an ecosystem, then that ecosystem is likely very healthy and suffering very little damage. But if they aren't present, then that can be an early sign that there is some sort of significant environmental damage happening. So some common environmental indicator species are trout. They're particularly sensitive fish species, so they're useful for monitoring the quality of waterways. Many birds are actually indicator species. They're very mobile, so it's easy for them to leave places that are under their quality standard. Butterflies are really sensitive because of the nature of their life cycle, and frogs, really all amphibians, again, because of their life cycle. Because of the way that their skin operates, they sort of use it as a second set of lungs. So they absorb chemicals very easily through their skin, which causes them to suffer from even small amounts of pollution. And worldwide, amphibian populations are on the decrease, which is one of the major indicators that there's kind of a global environmental crisis happening. So that's an indicator species. Then we have keystone species. And keystone species are species that play a larger role than you would expect within their ecosystem based on their biomass. So maybe there aren't very many of them in the ecosystem, but their role is sort of supersized to that. The term keystone comes from the anatomy of an arch, which has this center stone as the keystone holding everything together. If you remove that keystone, then the entire arch collapses. And that's the idea there, why they're called keystone. So they have a large effect on the types and abundance of other species. In our community, alligators are a keystone species. Many times top predators are keystone species because when you remove the top predators, then all of their food supply species populations increase, which leads to an over consumption of the producers, which can lead to a whole massive sort of domino effect within the ecosystem. Also, pollinators are major keystone species because they play a huge role in maintaining that producer population. And like we talked about today in class, the producer population as the basis of your food chain is incredibly important for the rest of biodiversity. So that those keystone species are particularly important. In your research for your national park, you have probably found reference to national park or to the keystone species within that ecosystem, because protecting those keystone species is vital for protecting biodiversity. And last but not least, we have foundation species. And foundation species are species that actually create or enhance habitats, physically create habitats which benefit other species. So our example here are elephants. Elephants are so large and often live on the edge or within forests. And as they walk through a forest, they actually create pathways that other animals can use. They often create those pathways between water sources. So they create literally like a physical map between water sources for other species to follow. Likewise, beavers are a foundation species because by building their dams, they actually change the course that waterways flow, creating new habitats for different kind of plants and animals to live in the lagoons behind their dams. So those are also foundational species. These species aren't necessarily as important for maintaining biodiversity as a whole, but they do have a larger role than you would expect just based on their niche because of their actions with the physical environment themselves. So foundational species are going to alter the physical environment in ways that benefit other species, while keystone species are going to sort of regulate both the physical environment and populations of other species more directly in a way that keeps the entire ecosystem functioning. So those are our 5 major roles that animals can play within their ecosystem. We will talk more next time about the relationships that species can have with each other.